Hi everyone, and welcome to the latest CTO Craft Bytes. Today we'll be discussing tools and approaches to measuring software development, enabling decision-making and monitoring the health of your engineering team. If this is your first time at CTO Craft, let me tell you a little bit more about this group. CTO Craft is a mentoring and coaching community for technology leaders around the world, focusing on supporting technologists in their leadership growth. Community numbers are over 1,200, and we provide one-on-one coaching, mentoring groups, an online community, and events like this one. So today I'm emceeing this Byte session. I'm CTO of Digital Solutions at iTechArt, and my name's Glyn Roberts. The first person I may introduce you to is Julian Colina. So CEO and founder of Haystack, formerly Director of Engineering at Iris TV. So could you give us a short introduction about yourself, please, Julian?
Sure. So yeah, I'm Julian, CEO and founder of Haystack. We work with hundreds of CTOs to help get them more visibility into how their team works. So we plug into GitHub and provide a ton of insights to answer questions like how quickly do we move, what are our biggest bottlenecks, and are we burning out? Prior to that, I was the director of engineering at Iris TV, where I helped scale them from nothing to hundreds of millions of global users and really taking a lot of the insights there and helping provide it to other teams.
Great to have you here. Next, may I introduce to you Clare Donald, the VP of Engineering at Moo. Great to have you here. Could you give us a short introduction about yourself, please?
Yeah, sure. Hey, folks. So I've been at Moo just over 2 years, where I've been leading our platform, the engineering, IT, and agile coaching functions, as well as leading a strategic company-wide initiative to build out a new platform so we can reach some new customers with some new products. Our team's a little bit smaller right now than it used to be, but was around 100 people pre-COVID. So keeping track of metrics and the health of the team is a big part of my job.
Fantastic. And last but not least, Reuben Sutton, Head of Engineering at Plandek. Could you give us a short introduction, please?
Sure. Hi, everyone. So I'm Reuben Sutton. I run the engineering team at a software metrics company called Plandek. In effect, we have two products. One called Plandek, which focuses on metrics as an end-to-end journey, and the other one, which is Build Tracker, which is very focused on DevOps.
Fantastic. So great to have you all here. Thank you for making the time. We'll save time at the end for the audience to ask your own questions. And if you ask questions that are relevant to the conversation ongoing, I'll jump in with your question at the same time. So please ask any questions you've got with the Ask a Question link just underneath our video. And people can upvote their favorite ones from there as well. So let's start talking about meaningful software metrics. So the first question. What are software metrics and why do we need them? Julian, would you like to kick us off with this, please?
Yeah, definitely. Software metrics, I think from a really high level, what we're talking about are quantitative ways of measuring how we work and some of the impact of that work. For me, what they really enable us to do is spot bottlenecks, trends, and ultimately improve how we work together. Plus giving engineering leaders and managers ways of quantitatively expressing that improvement to other stakeholders in the business. So, why we need metrics, I think they're great for early warning signs and lead indicators when things might be going wrong. To enable communication for the team, if somebody's stuck, you can immediately kind of flag that and have a conversation about how to move forward. Another great way to use metrics is creating a feedback loop so you can actually make process changes and see the impact from sprint to sprint. Plus aligning the engineering and business side so you can advocate for your team, engineering initiatives, refactors, more budget and tooling. I think metrics are great for kind of supplying engineering leaders with this kind of tool set.
Excellent. Ruben, would you like to add any further description of software metrics and why we need them?
Yeah, sure. So I think one of the really key things, most of the really key things about software metrics, Julian has covered, but I think one that I prize very highly is that metrics can be a really powerful tool to help you give your teams greater autonomy. So bringing to bear, like, if you can see if something's going wrong, you don't need to be checking if things are going wrong quite so often. Certainly not in a very micromanagey way.
Excellent. Okay, then. So, Claire, what would you say are the most important metrics to track?
Oh, I mean, there's so much to choose from, isn't there? It's absolutely mind-boggling on where to even start. I mean, to build upon the previous question, a key consideration to think of is, what are you using this data for? What decisions is it trying to drive? If you're not using metrics to help guide your decisions, why are you even doing it? They should be there to help you make judgments or identify the next set of actions. If they're just vanity metrics there to make you feel or look good, then they're not useful to anybody. I mean, another aspect that I like to think of is and remind myself of is that not all metrics need to be tracked at that sort of overarching level. Some teams might have a particular issue that they're working through or a short-term goal, which is important to them, but meaningless to anyone else. To be honest, it might not mean much to anyone else. You as a leader, you don't need to track every single thing centrally and monitor everything. Just like Ruben was saying, these metrics could be useful to give you confidence that someone in each of the teams is doing something about it, and you focus on those more overarching trends. So yeah, I like to use metrics that identify systemic issues and trends linked to speed and quality, because I think these two things are interrelated and correlated. You can be going really, really fast, but introducing quality issues and failure into your system. I'm a big fan of the DevOps metrics described in Accelerate. Like they're great for this. They focus on those two aspects really, really well. Those that are unfamiliar with them are their lead time, the time that it takes for your idea to be come up with to the point that's in production. Although cycle time can be an easier starting point for many teams. It's a little bit easier to track and get started there. Then deployment frequency, how often you're releasing into a production system. And then the two quality aspects around change fail percentage. So when you're deploying all the time, are you introducing bugs into the system? And then when something does break, mean time to recovery. So how long it takes you to recover. So I mean, yeah, obviously there's tons and tons and many, many more, but I think these four give you a good indication of the health of the system as a whole. And if you're not even able to track those four metrics, that's useful information within itself, and giving you some pointers on where to go and make some fixes.
Excellent. And Ruben, would you identify different metrics that are those are most important to you normally when you start looking at this?
So for us, the most important metrics are metrics that you can influence. So it's very nice. Lots of numbers are very nice, but if they don't give you any point to actually change them, they're largely only useful in retrospect. And so to be more specific, like the metric that certainly I love the most is we capture lead time from the point that the work is created in your ticket tracking system all the way to production, which is we think is very powerful. But I think the number two for me is purely like the engagement and the happiness of the team. So that's quite an easy thing to quantify, and it's an easy thing to work on. And so if you have an unhappy team, whatever else you do to the process isn't fundamentally going to improve the process. You're just going to be still suffering from high attrition rates. So happiness and the outcome measurement that stakeholders really care about are the most important two for me.
How do you measure happiness within your team? Do you send surveys out weekly or something along those lines?
Yeah, we send out regular automated surveys. Our survey questions were based on the Spotify Agile Health Check questions, but with some specific modifications for us. I think that's always quite a useful place to start in terms of quantification.
Okay, great. And Julian, any other metrics that you mainly focus on or care about most?
Yeah, definitely. I think I want to touch a little bit on what Claire said, which is, there's a ton of metrics that we can measure, and we really have to think about which ones we should, because a lot of them I think we've seen in the past go wrong. Lines of code, I think, even number of commits and all these kind of metrics that we can pull fairly easily often can actually hurt our culture And like Ruben was saying, culture is one of the biggest drivers of productivity on a team. If you don't have a great culture, great trust on the team, then what are you doing optimizing a process? There's larger issues that we should be tackling. But for me, when I think about metrics and what we should track, I'm thinking about why I'm even measuring in the first place. And I think ultimately what I would want on my team is, a productive, happy team. I want to be able to drive improvement and express that improvement to other stakeholders in the business. And when you think about what a productive team really looks like, for me, it's not, lines of code or number of commits per day. It's how responsive is the team to one another? Are we collaborating effectively? Do we have a really efficient process? It's these things that day-to-day developers really care about. And we like to call them process metrics. So, we have a whole book on our website on this, but just to name a few, cycle time, which I think has been mentioned, time spent in development versus reworking code versus review, gives you a great high-level picture of, where we're spending time and if somebody might be stuck. There's rate of merged pull requests, and specifically comparing that to what you typically do, so you can particularly tell when there's anomalies that are too high and too low, and you can have conversations around, how to fix that. Concurrent work is something that we highly suggest kind of keeping track on. We see a lot of hero syndrome in engineering teams where engineers feel that they need to take on a lot of work and it's actually incentivized at the company, but you can see a lot of long-term negative effects from that actually, as well as workload balance and responsiveness. Code review responsiveness, comment responsiveness. So you can tell these are all kind of metrics that revolve around the process and how we're working together. That eventually boil up into productivity, but what we like to focus on is these metrics that are great lead indicators when you as an engineering leader can start to jump in and have these conversations before it's too late, before your next retrospective. So that's a lot of what we like to focus on.
Excellent, thank you. And we've already got one question just following on from Claire's statement. So how do you track the DORA metric, mean time to recover, if you have blue-green deployments and the system never actually fails?
Oh, what a nice problem to have. I've never experienced that myself. Yeah, I mean, I could make a suggestion, and it's simulation, isn't it? It's doing war games or scenarios where you chaos engineering, doing whatever you need to do in order to stress test your system.
Okay, great. Yeah, it's definitely not a bad problem to have at all, is it? Okay, then as we move on to the next one. So how do we prevent metrics from being misused? Julian, please.
Yeah, so there's really three things that I think about when we're talking about how to prevent misuse. The first thing is I really like to avoid individual metrics. Individuals, vastly different in terms of skill set, experience, their particular work in the system. It's all very different. And when we attempt to focus at the individual rather than the team, what we end up doing is comparing and ranking, which makes engineers feel like they're over incentivized to optimize any particular metric. You're kind of pinning engineers against each other, and there's a sense of mistrust when you start to say, hey, you only did 100 lines of code today, what's going wrong? So the second thing is we like to measure process and not output. Again, things like lines of code are purely looking at the output of a team, and we at Haystack don't believe that that's what you want to measure. And if you did want to measure that, you're kind of treating your team like a feature factory where, we're just measuring output and that's what we care about. When, if we're being honest with ourselves, that's only like the tip of the iceberg when it comes to engineering. And the last one, I think Ruben touched on this as well, is kind of actionability. So with every metric, we should have targets rather than absolutes. If you have an absolute, let's say, we need to produce, we're producing 1,000 lines of code every week. What does that really mean? I think a better way to look at metrics is, we should have a goal of a 24-hour turnaround when you're assigned to a review. So really having these concrete targets that your team can start to focus on and hit rather than having absolutes. So those are three ways that we kind of see prevent metrics from being misused.
Sure. And Claire, do you have other ways to prevent metrics from being misused?
On a similar point there, I think it's important not to compare teams as well as individuals. I think each team is different. The software that they're working on is different and has a unique set of challenges. And I've worked in places, and maybe I've even done it myself in my long distant past. You're comparing things like velocity and outputs from a team with another team. because it's the only bit of data you've got, and that's really not a healthy place to go. So I think avoiding comparisons when you can, when they're uncomparable, is a good way to avoid misusing metrics.
Absolutely. And the lines of code is one I've seen about 10 years ago, where a CEO was assessing all his employees on the number of lines of code they created, which obviously means nothing valuable at all, does it? Okay, then. So, Ruben, how do software and people metrics relate?
So I think they're fairly inseparable, because software development is at its heart a human process. And so the best that metrics can give you is windows into the black box of what's actually going on in your team. And so I think you have to assume good faith in the teams that you're tracking the work on, because I think unless you've got, say, particular people with, say, problems that you need to manage in your teams, people typically want to do good work, want to succeed, and want to work hard. And for me, it's really about using metrics to help the team perform better, and use that to drive your attrition rates down.
Sure. Great. Claire, any additional comments?
Yeah, I agree with Ruben. I think there's a strong correlation there, and I don't think you should look at one without the other, to be honest. I think what you see in your software and metrics impact the people ones, and vice versa. Ruben touched on this earlier. He was talking about the happiness of his teams, and I've worked in teams where I've seen the engagement scores and the engagement scores go down, and the retention rates go up. And when you probe that little bit deeper and talk to them around why, and start correlating them with the tech metrics. I've seen trends in multiple teams where the cycle times are really, really high and the deployment frequencies are really, really low, and engineers are just getting frustrated and disengaged with the work and the company. You assume positive intent. Everybody wants to come to work to do a good job, and they just want to get stuff done. I think if this leads you to probe a little bit deeper somewhere else, and quite often these are linked to the level of tech debt. I think this is a great conversation starter with our peers in product to be talking about why we should be prioritizing some of these technical debt, engineering work, when you can show some strong correlation and links to team engagement and retention rates, and prioritizing some of that work.
Okay, great. And the two questions we've already got from the audience are actually quite related to my next question. So I'll do my next question, then bring those two questions in to tie in. Ruben, to start using metrics successfully, how should you approach rolling them out into a team?
So I think the first thing you need to do is figure out why you're rolling out metrics. What objective are you hoping to achieve? What benefit are you hoping to see from the metrics? And using that, if you walk into a all hands with your engineering team and say, hey, we're going to start measuring you today, it's not going to be well received. But if you walk into your all hands and say, hey, we think breaking our stories down into smaller chunks so we're delivering faster is valuable, and we're going to use metrics to help us track this journey, people buy into it a lot more. I think you have to also be honest and transparent about that you're doing it and why you're doing it. And I think, to sum up, basically, I think people buy into the company and the team doing better. They don't care about the metrics. And when I say people, I mean the individual contributors. Hopefully the managers reporting to you will in fact care about the metrics.
Sure. And Julian?
Yeah, I largely agree with what Ruben said. I think it's all about context and delivery when it comes to implementing metrics. I think a lot of teams, you talked about lines of code, and that was something that historically happened to teams, and the individual contributors and engineers were largely the ones who suffered when we use metrics like that, especially when used to compare and rank and establish bonuses and all this kind of stuff. So I think it's really important to establish context and why we're doing this. And specifically be clear, we're not trying to fire anybody, compare anybody. Metrics alone cannot tell a story. This is a tool for the team to improve. For example, using a tool like ours, we actually point out burnout. This is a tool for the team. If you're doing too much work, or if one person is doing a significant portion of the work in the sprint, we can point that out because it's about team health at the end of the day. Software is a team sport, and I think that it should be really clear why you're planning to use metrics, and that really helps get buy-in. Another thing that we kind of suggest is doing a trial run with metrics. You can actually see impact once you start using metrics from sprint to sprint, and I think it's really powerful when the team kind of sits down and says, what happens if we do break down story points a little bit clearer, or what happens if we do implement this process to clarify the product spec prior to us working on it. And we can actually see how that affects the metrics over time from sprint to sprint. And it's actually really empowering for teams to go in and actually collaborate together on how to improve these metrics.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, I just wanted to build on Julian's point there. I'm sorry, Glyn.
Please go ahead. Yeah.
I think you're touching on there of getting people to contribute more. And one of the problems and solutions I've seen in the past is, if you enforce a certain set of metrics top down, straight away you're going to face resistance. So you're asking teams themselves to start identifying what they would like to track themselves is vital as well. Different teams will notice different problems unique to them, and letting them have a say and an input in what they're going to track and measure means that they care about it more. They're more likely to take action upon the insight that they're collating and use it to improve.
Excellent. Okay, then. So, like I said, these two audience questions are quite nicely tied into this piece. I'll start off with Usam's one. There might be metrics that might pull the team in different directions. For example, a pull request turnaround time versus people responding to production issues. I feel there's a hierarchy and context needed. What's your experience in creating the context? To whoever wants to try and answer that first. Julian was looking for that.
I can give my best shot at this. I think hierarchy is pretty interesting. If your servers are down, I think as a team, we know that the servers need to go back up. I think when we get into this decision between, should I go review that thing, or should I put out a prod server? I think we're missing the point of metrics entirely. I think that it needs to be a much higher level conversation where you sit down and say, okay, this is our review time, and this is how fast we respond to prod issues. And it really shouldn't be this thing where you're choosing between the two, because no one metric can get the job done. I think it's a balance between all these things. Like Claire was saying, if you're emphasizing speed, then all of a sudden quality might go down. And it's not about one or the other. It's really about a balance at the end of the day. And I think it's the same for this particular question, pull request turnaround time versus responding to prod issues. I think it's pretty clear which one needs to happen first. And at the end of the day, we need to take a higher level approach and say, okay, what's the balance between these two things? And is that a healthy balance that we all agree with?
Great. Claire, anything you want to add on top?
Yeah, more on the second point than the first one. I think that a key bit's being aware and having visibility of what you're actually doing. So, rather than thinking about, pull v push and what's the correlation between the two, just knowing what you're actually spending your time doing. So you're tracking your work well, tagging them if need be, and standing back and looking at the shape of that work. How much of your work is responding to incidents, how much of it is planned, how much of it is technical work, how much is it business work for a certain line of business. And it's not about, I don't think it's about hitting a certain percentage and carving your day up in a Tetris-like manner. It's just being aware of what you're doing, and then you can assess whether that's the right balance or not. And again, you can have really, really healthy discussions then with the wider business, product people, whoever, on, we're spending 80% of our time doing, this project, and we're doing no maintenance, or it may well be the other way around. So you're tagging and visualizing your work to help have discussions, rather than trying to hit set percentages to split is a better conversation starter in my experience.
Excellent, thank you. Okay then, and one that sort of ties in quite nicely as well. Has anyone implemented a metric gathering tools like Plandek's Pluralsight Flow example, etc.? How was this received by the teams? Personally, I feel this can hurt the culture if not done from the right place. So we have touched on this a little bit already. Ruben first, maybe?
Yeah. So, see, I haven't, apart from my own team using it, I haven't personally led the implementation. So what we do to stop this problem, though, is we have a very good customer success team to guide people into good behaviors and into not destroying the harmony of the team, and also to help with things like Julian and Clare were just talking about, where helping people find that balance with metrics, help them to figure out how to use metrics to get what they need. And so if you use them, ultimately, if you sell it to a company that's determined to use them in a negative way, the results are going to be negative, but we work quite hard to avoid that.
Sure. And anyone else want to comment on how they've implemented information gathering like this, and how they made it feel like it's coming from the right place inside the business?
Yeah, I can speak to that a bit. So Haystack falls into the same realm as Pluralsight, and I'm sure Plandek as well. We do gather information, and one of the key reasons why I actually started working on Haystack was because I saw some flaws in the current implementations. I think Pluralsight is a great example. There are a lot of things that kind of correlate to lines of code, so their impact scores, and kind of correlate to comparing and ranking and leaderboarding engineers. Typical things that, I often hear, I trust myself with this data, but I don't trust that this data would be misused in somebody else's hands. So the way that we kind of approach that whole problem is we take the successful patterns that we've seen of teams actually implementing metrics. For example, not looking at individual metrics. And we purposely leave that out of the product entirely. We have healthy bounds on things like merge rate and throughput, so that teams can understand this is what you've done historically. And this is typically a healthy area for you, so that when, even if you hand it off to somebody who's not in the department, they can easily understand, okay, this is actually too much throughput. And you stop getting the questions of, hey, can we work faster? Can we work faster? So we kind of do that by implementing a lot of these cultural concerns into the product itself, rather than kind of giving all the data possible. It's more of a curated step-by-step guide into how to implement data. So that's kind of one of the ways that we try to mitigate the misuse, by straight up not allowing it in the tool.
Okay, excellent. And probably one for Clare then. Do you advise measuring unplanned work? And if so, how do you measure it?
How do you plan or measure unplanned work? Like I said before, I asked the team to keep track of it. So they maybe retrospectively, but they're tracking what they've spent their time on. I've seen them implement that with simple tags in Jira, or using component tags. And it's not like I say, hit a certain threshold or not, but at the end of a period of time, you can stand back and look at what you're doing and the reality of the situation. To give an example, our platform team done this and realised that they were spending, the equivalent of a full person's day doing reactive work, either responding to incidents or to requests from other teams. Therefore, the team created themselves, off the back of this insight, a different mechanism and a rotation of one of them being like the I don't want to call it the support person, but they were on call, and they were manning the internal help channels for the other teams. And that was a method that they devised in order to cope with the unplanned work better, and worked really well for them.
Okay. And touching on that with the follow-up question, are there any prerequisites to collecting good work process matrix? I'm thinking whether to get all teams onto one Asana, Jira, Trello board, for example. Also, how much effort should an organization put into consistent tagging, labeling of work? Example, like you mentioned there, planned, unplanned, defects, features. Claire, probably just continue with that.
Yeah, I mean it's a freaking nightmare, to be perfectly honest. And you know, whilst it sounds perfect using a tool like Julian or Reuben's described, or you're getting every one team into using the same thing. You know, the reality is that we don't live in a perfect world. You know, we all work in organisations that have grown organically, or expanded, shrunk. You know, the people that wrote the software in the first place have gone away. And yeah, of course, if we were starting from scratch and building something greenfield, then I would certainly put effort into getting everyone working on, at least working with a similar tool chain, in order that you'd at least have the data in the first place. But yeah, the reality is that it's just not where the vast majority of us are, and we have to make compromises and figure out what will work. And going back to the accelerate metrics example that I described earlier, when we first implemented that at Moo, in fact, it still isn't perfect, because it's really, really hard to gather and track that information if you don't have it gathered in one place centrally, and that's the reality of most of our jobs. So you've got to find some compromises and figure out what the 80-20 rule at the end of the day. You can still get some good actionable insight from data that is imperfect. That you don't have to be a slave to the data. You're gathering some insights there to help you make decisions. You don't have to be a slave to the data that's coming out. One of the ones that we found particularly hard to measure and still haven't resolved is change fail percentage, just because the way of our legacy software is deployed. It's really, really hard for us to track and manage that. But like our compromise, and it's a crude, dirty compromise, was to at least look at the number of incidents we were having and dividing that by the deployment frequency. So really, really brash, but at least there was some sort of indicator for us to assess whether there was a correlation between the frequency in which we were deploying things and the volume of incidents we were causing ourselves. So yeah, I don't know if I answered the question or not, but I guess I'm just saying that the world is not perfect. It's not black and white. And whilst it sounds great to move everyone onto the same tool, the same process, huge amount of effort required to do that unless you're starting from greenfield. And my advice would be to figure out where you can make compromises.
Yeah. Do you mind if I add something to that?
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah. Sorry. So this is something we see a lot. Sorry, my son's just wandering around in his tie-dye t-shirt. So this is something we see a lot. So there is generally sort of two camps with the customers that we work with. Either one is sort of unrestrained complexity, like I think one of our large customers has, I think, 200 and something Jira projects, and almost all of them have a different process from the other, which is chaos, but it's a problem that we're able to solve because they're actually clear about what they do. It might not be consistent, but it is consistent in concept. Dev processes have a sort of fairly typical set of stages. But on the other hand, when people attempt to put large organizations on, say, one Jira workflow, one process, everyone on one tool, you end up with, well, for a start, you end up needing a team to manage that instance of Jira because it gets pretty out of control. But also what ends up happening is you end up with very specific, unwritten cultural meanings for different statuses. So our customers has a single Jira process and it has a stage called in review. And across the organization, that's used from anything from stakeholder UAT to code review to PO review to dev review. It's absolute chaos. And that's the sort of problem where it becomes very hard to unpick.
Certainly. Okay, excellent. Thanks for that. Julian, do you want to add anything else to this?
I think for metrics, there's really two things to think about. It's one, how easy is it to collect, and how easy is it to actually use? How actionable is it? And I think both Ruben and Clare gave some excellent points of some of the complexities that I'm sure a lot of the listeners here are facing in terms of how do we actually collect this. It's a really difficult problem. There's a ton of legacy workflows you have to work through. A lot of different tagging, different teams have different processes. I mean, our approach was, let's make collection as easy as possible. Everybody uses GitHub or Bitbucket or GitLab, and let's just start from there. Garbage in, garbage out, typically with these types of analytics tools. So let's try to have clean data and get as much actionability out of it as possible. That way it's low touch, and your teams don't, you don't have to spin up a whole new team just to start managing these metrics, which, a lot of companies actually end up falling into that trap. So I think there's a balance. I certainly wouldn't, like Ruben said, rework your entire organization into one Jira workflow just to get a few metrics out. Let's just like anything, let's start with the low-hanging fruit, and let's try to see what we can get and how useful it is for your team. And obviously, you always start with what metrics do we need and why do we need them. But whatever the shortest path to that is, without creating too much, what is basically the equivalent of technical debt. Reworking everybody into one Jira workflows, company debt, just like technical debt would be. So just think about it carefully before actually diving into a big project like that.
Okay, fantastic. And Claire, then, so how should metrics link into objectives and KRs?
Yeah, I was thinking about this as we were talking earlier. We've talked a lot about technical metrics and things that are useful to the engineering community. But ultimately we're here to serve the needs of the business. Whatever business it is that we're working in. So I think any metrics that we track and measure. Moo uses a OKR framework. Many companies seem to do the same. And I think part of our job as technology leaders is to be able to show how our teams work links and contributes to those business metrics. So the teams understanding those business metrics, those business KRs, and knowing how their work contributes. And where it's not clear, I think we have a job as leaders to translate that for them and help them figure out how they can move the needle on those business metrics. So yeah, whilst we've talked a lot about technology-oriented measurements in the last half hour or so, I also believe that every technical team should care about the business metrics as well, and should be figuring out ways to help move them as well. Everybody should care about them.
Okay then. So as we talk about OKRs, and a lot of businesses have OKRs, can metrics tell you everything you need to know about your company? Who wants to have a crack on that first? Julian, maybe?
Can metrics tell you everything you need to know about your company? No. Put simply, I think I don't think that metrics alone can tell the full story. I think I mentioned that before. There's certainly a great tool where you can proxy some work into higher level OKRs and business objectives, but as a whole, I don't think metrics tell you the entire story. And you could probably talk to the sales and marketing department about their metrics as well, which are fairly established, and they'll tell you that it doesn't tell you everything that's going on within their company or their department either. To a certain extent, they measure number of meetings this week, but does that really tell you how good the sales deck is and how good our inbound process is? I don't think that it tells the full story. Although it might help with their pipeline and their process, it certainly won't give you the higher level. I think in general, the way that I think about business metrics and some of these software metrics that we're talking about is you should certainly be aware of both of them. But where business metrics are typically lagging indicators that can tell you, how happy are the customers, how well do we serve them, they don't necessarily help you with the day-to-day or the sprint-to-sprint improvement. And so they're really, they relate to each other, but live in kind of separate worlds. And we should be aware of both of them. That's kind of how I picture the two relating.
Okay. Great. So we've got one question from Andy Skipper, who everyone knows on the CTO Craft group. So it's a question for each of you individually, actually. So what is the best story you've seen told using metrics from an engineering team? We'll start off with Claire.
I've given 2 examples already. Let me think of another one. So a project that we had ongoing at Moo this year was for us to revamp our mobile experience. We've never historically had a great mobile experience because we thought that people that would be designing products wouldn't necessarily be doing it on a mobile phone. Therefore, never really prioritised that work. But trends change, consumer habits change, and doing everything on your mobile is a thing now. So the team, after they've done their normal sort of estimating on how long the work would take, and doing a really good job of breaking it down into smaller chunks, worked with the wider business team to show the impact of the work that they were doing, and they were tracking as well as how fast they were delivering the outputs, but what the actual business outcomes were. And we've seen real big changes in our conversion rates and drop-off rates at different points in our journey based on tests that the team were doing, and they're able to really quickly adapt and change things as we went along. And that was implemented just before Christmas last year, and we had some real big wins there. We got a whole bunch more traffic coming to the site via that mechanism, even if they didn't complete their journey on their mobile device. We've seen them coming back to the desktop later, which also helped us think about different ways to be using our marketing spend and direct traffic. So a whole bunch of different metrics there from business and technical orientated place, showing the positive impact that quite a not a huge project, but a project had on the company.
Cool. Ruben, have you got a story for us?
It's a good question. So the one that immediately springs to mind, one of our customers was struggling with their engineers on average leaving after 8 months, which is horrifying. At that point, your recruiter budget ends up being a significant amount of your spend. And focusing very much on the team health, they managed to, I can't remember what they reduced it to offhand, but make a really, really strong improvement in that, which obviously saves them money, and their team's actually happy now, which is probably the nicest thing of all.
Okay, excellent. And Julian?
I have 2 stories that come to mind. There's a lot of use for metrics, but my particular favorites are when you're able to protect the team and actually advocate for the team. I think it's a beautiful story of how to use metrics to actually enable culture instead of hurt it, which is historically, that's always a concern when you're using metrics. The first one is we had an engineering manager and an engineer, both unaware of this problem. I think this happens on many teams where the engineer was doing a lot of work very quickly in parallel, and there wasn't any issues with quality or anything like that. So from an outside perspective, everything was going well. Our system kept pointing it out and, sending alerts every day. This engineer is doing a lot of work. It's kind of abnormal. And at first the manager didn't think anything of it. It's that's just Tom. That's just how he works. But eventually I had a conversation about it, and they realized, both Tom and the manager, that, I'm doing way too much work right now. I felt that I needed to take the work off the other engineers because I'm more senior. And what that ended up leading to is an unsustainable working pattern that kind of slipped under the radar for quite some time. So I was super happy that, having these alerts around metrics was actually able to prevent something like that, that would otherwise have slipped under the radar. Another one, this is actually my favorite story, which is an organization that was largely non-technical, would continuously go to the team and say, hey, we need to do more. We need to do more. And I think we get that story all the time. We hear kind of horror cases like that. And after plugging in our tool, because we looked 6 months past, they're actually able to show, hey, last time you did this to us, our team entirely burnt out. And we got 1/3 of the amount of work done after you did this last time. So it was one of the first times that I've heard, okay, here's the actual impacts on the business decisions that we're making on the team. And it's another thing that, largely goes under the radar, because the team's usually pretty good about hitting goals. You say move faster, and then we kind of do to a certain extent. And then the business says, okay, see, I told you could do it. Meanwhile, we're sitting here being like, well, that's very much not sustainable. So those are two of my favorite stories when it comes to metrics, actually being able to protect the team with them.
Okay, great. And while we're still on you, Julian, are metrics good for measuring individual performance? Because you mentioned there where it was positive impact because you're able to identify individual performance as an issue. So is it actually a good tool for measuring individual performance for, quarterly reviews, for example?
I would generally say no. And in my previous example, I would kind of point out that workload balance isn't necessarily an individual performance metric. At least that's not really how it should be used. So I'd say no. There's so many things that actually correlate to an individual's performance, I'd say, whether it's the skill set, number of years they've actually been developing, how much experience do they have on this particular project or repo, or even this piece of the architecture. It all very much differs. And I've been on teams where one individual might not actually contribute that much as an individual, but he's helping the team. He's almost 10xing the entire team because he knows so much about the system that he's, able to do code review and all this stuff that actually enhances the rest of it. So how can you actually produce one metric or a set of metrics that says this engineer is better than this one? I simply don't believe we're there yet. Maybe in the future, but I don't think that's a good idea for right now.
Yeah, I agree there. Okay, then Claire, so you touched on this briefly in your previous comments. Should tech teams care about business metrics and vice versa? Could you explain a little bit more what you mean there?
Yeah, I'm trying to go deeper on what I said before. So yeah, every technical team probably works closer with a certain part of the business than others. These could be internal or external customers, to be honest. And each of these other business areas are about to have a set of metrics that are important to them. And technology should be helping and enabling the rest of the business to do whatever it is that they need to do. Be that an internal or an external customer. So yeah, I think you can get too insular and look too closely at yourself and be too introverted, without considering the wider context. If you go down that path, you end up focusing more on outputs rather than outcomes, and you're building a feature factory. Some companies want that type of model, and I'm not saying it's fine, but that is a model. And that might be the types of metrics that companies want to work with. But yeah, really, you need the two to be coming together to have actual value for the company. So I think it's important for the technology team to understand those business metrics. But yeah, it's true the other way around. And I think we spend a lot of time as technology leaders talking about how we can translate technical stuff to the business, linking our technical work back up to the business stuff. But yeah, there's less talk, or maybe it's just the circles I frequenting, less talk of it the other way around. And business people taking the time and effort to understand what the metrics mean from a technology perspective. You don't need to be a hardcore technologist to understand some basic concepts. And some of the ones that we talked about earlier, such as cycle time and lead time, your business people actually have a big input in, and it can have a tremendous impact on the team as well. So yeah, I think it does work both ways, and we should be putting time and effort into helping each other understand each other's metrics in order for us to fuse the two together.
Yeah, absolutely. Touching on that is actually falling nicely into my next question. So how should metric results be communicated to the rest of the business? Ruben?
So I think the key thing with communicating metric results is to try and avoid too much granularity. No one wants to, I think Julian's done a very good job of explaining this point, but you don't want to be sending lists of individual engineers to, say, the CEO, because there's a very natural jump to, well, why is this guy not reviewing PRs very fast? But I think ultimately you want to only really be communicating outwards the outcome metrics. So the lead time, the cycle time, where it demonstrates that they're seeing a tangible benefit from the hard work that the team is putting in.
Sure. Julian, any additional comments?
No, I largely agree. I think two things that are particularly helpful when communicating to the business is, one, keep it high level, team. keep it at the team level. And two, trends are a really great way of actually communicating to the business, because you're not comparing anybody aside from yourself. We're improving, or this actually got slower because of X, Y, Z, and maybe we need to invest in some tooling or refactor or additional budget so we can hire a few more engineers. So I think trends are a great way to actually avoid a lot of the misuse with regard to leaderboards and ranking, and just talk about how are we doing right now relative to where we were 6 months ago, and how is everything that we're doing actually impacting some of those metrics.
Okay. So Julian, how would you start to find the right metrics for your business then? What should CTOs, C-level individuals be looking at first to identify what's correct for them?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it comes down to, why are you measuring at all? And I think there's a lot of different answers to that question. For me, I think I touched on this before. It's about, I want a happy and productive team. And what does that mean to me? It's that they're responsive to one another. We're communicating effectively. Our process is really great. And because of that, the metrics that we use often correlate to those things so that we can actually touch on them and make sure people aren't waiting for help for too long. The code reviews are smooth. And we're not burning ourselves out with too much workload based on what we historically are able to do. Whereas, there's often different answers to that question. I think the Accelerate book is a great example of other metrics that you can start to use as well, a little bit higher level. And yeah.
Okay, great. Essentially, how difficult is it to define the decision criteria from your metrics? So as a business, you want to produce, higher quality output, whatever that decision is. How do you actually define the decision criteria from that? Claire?
Yeah, it's really hard. There's a couple of ways to do it. So there's a way of defining your overarching objective, your result, and then your measurement, and then going off and enacting it, which sounds like the right way to do it. But sometimes you need to try a little bit and understand a little bit more of your problem space to figure out what's measurable, and what's actually useful for you to measure. We all know that the phrase, what gets measured gets done. And if you get to, if you set that high level metric wrong, you could end up sending a team off in the wrong direction by focusing too much on the measurement itself. So I think it can be a little bit. I think it has to be a little bit top down and bottom up of testing and tweaking as you go in order to get the right fine tuning of what success actually looks like for you. It's not easy.
Okay then, and Ruben, what would you say is how long the measurement periods should actually be?
I think it depends a lot on which metrics you're looking at. So and also the role that you're playing with the teams. If you're, say, directly involved with a team doing sprints, you probably want to be checking daily, every couple of days, to track the progress. If you're looking at overarching metrics that align to your company strategy or to your technology strategy, probably looking weekly, bi-weekly, monthly is going to do a lot more for you, because the data from day to day is just going to be very noisy. You're going to see trends, and the trend goes away the next day.
Sure. So a daily board of all metrics make no value to you unless obviously you're in an area which is obviously specified to what your actual output is.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay. Excellent. Okay, then cool. So we're sort of coming to the end of this now. So if I could ask you to sort of do a summary of what the most important things are to you about metrics and what you should be watching out for, it'll be a great way to sort of finish off this conversation. So let's start off with Claire, as you're the top person on my screen.
To summarize up, I think software metrics are just one component, and I think when you're thinking about what measurements are useful to track track what's going on in your team, you need to be thinking about people, process, and technology metrics, because they're all interrelated and interconnected. I think it's useful to remember that your quantitative data is interesting, but you need qualitative as well. And all of this different data should help you be making decisions and judgments and helping you fix problems. Otherwise, why are you going to the effort of tracking it all?
Excellent. Julian?
I think Claire did a great job of summarizing this entire conversation, actually. We answered a lot with, it depends. What are you trying to measure? And largely that's the answer, right? There's no silver bullet for any of this metric stuff. We like to focus on team and process, obviously. I hammer that home all the time. But it honestly depends. And if anybody's listening and is wondering how you should implement metrics, feel free to email me or just reach out anytime. I'd be happy to help. I talk about this stuff literally all day, every day. So, yeah.
Excellent. And Ruben, something to finish us off with.
Yeah. So again, I largely agree with Claire. The focus really has to be on achieving things with metrics and making sure that you have a happy, motivated team. So yeah, and much like Julian, I also think about this all day and quite a long time into the evenings. So yeah, again, I'm always happy to talk more about it.
Excellent. Okay, well, I'll show you contact details in a second. So thank you, Julian, Claire, and Ruben, for talking with us today. It's been excellent. You can connect with all of our speakers on the links I'm just sharing in the message board now. So there's their LinkedIn and their websites if you want to send any follow-up questions to them to pick their brains. Our next CTO Craft Bytes session will be on dealing with people debt with Matt Bradburn this Friday at lunchtime, 12:30. The link to the event is also in the chat now. So thank you all for joining us today. Hope you've enjoyed it. It's been excellent for me, and enjoy the rest of your week. Thanks so much, guys.
See you guys.
All right.